There are moments when you think you know someone's story at a glance, but what if everything you assumed was dead wrong? Witness a journey where judgment meets undeniable honor, and let us know in the comments section below if you've ever seen respect given too late. There was a discipline in the way Jonathan Watts moved, even if the world had stopped noticing. His steps were precise, his head held at an angle that once measured threat levels and wind speeds without conscious thought. The heavy duffel bag over his shoulder wasn't just some crumpled carrier of clothes. It was weighted down with everything he owned and everything he used to be. The street corner near Madison and 8th had become his usual place, the cracked sidewalk his new terrain. No one made eye contact. Mothers clutched their purses tighter, teenagers snickered without even trying to hide it. Jonathan took it all in with the same steady indifference he had once shown enemy fire. On this particular afternoon, two men leaned against the hood of a patrol car across the street, arms folded, laughing about something only they found funny. Officer Derek Malone and Officer Tyler Grant. Malone, grizzled and past his prime, had the permanent scowl of a man who felt the city owed him something. Grant, his rookie shadow, laughed too hard at jokes he barely understood, desperate for approval. "You see that guy?" Malone jerked his chin toward Jonathan. "Bet you $20 he's got a rap sheet as long as my arm." Grant squinted. "Just looks like another bum, man." "Exactly. Waste of skin. Probably high, drunk, or both." Malone pushed off the car, swagger in his step, and started crossing the street. Grant hesitated, checked the time, but followed. It was too easy to kick down when you thought no one was watching. And in their minds, no one ever watched people like Jonathan Watts. Jonathan knew they were coming long before they reached him. He adjusted the strap of his duffel without a word, muscles tensing not from fear but from muscle memory. His mind flipped through silent scenarios: de-escalate, disengage, survive. Old instincts rising like smoke from embers he thought were long dead. Malone arrived first, his shadow falling across Jonathan's boots. "Hey!" Malone barked. "Can't loiter here." "Move it." Jonathan met his gaze, slow and steady. No fear, no aggression, just a quiet, battered kind of dignity. "I'm not bothering anyone," Jonathan said, voice low and even. Grant shifted uncomfortably, but Malone grinned like a wolf spotting a limping deer. "You don't get to call this shots, hobo," Malone sneered. "Move along before I help you." Jonathan said nothing. He simply turned and began to gather his things. There was a silence between them, a thin electric wire stretched tight. Malone hated that silence. It wasn't compliance. It was defiance, by another name. He stepped closer. "What? You too good to answer me now?" Jonathan zipped his duffel slowly, methodically, every move calm and controlled. The moment felt heavy. Even Grant sensed it. "Maybe we should just let it go," Grant muttered. "He's not doing anything." But Malone had already decided he needed a win today, no matter how small. With a hard shove, he knocked Jonathan's duffel from his hands, scattering its few contents across the filthy sidewalk: a weathered journal, a battered set of dog tags, and a faded commendation certificate laminated under cracked plastic. The dog tags hit the concrete with a sharp metallic clink. Grant froze. Malone didn't even notice. Jonathan bent to pick up the tags, his fingers pausing for just a fraction of a second over the cold steel. Something inside him, long dormant, stirred. "You really think you're something, don't you?" Malone jeered. Jonathan stood up slowly, holding the dog tags in one hand. His back straightened a fraction. His presence seemed to grow somehow, without him saying a single word. In the hazy mid-afternoon heat, for a moment he looked less like a vagrant and more like a soldier, standing against impossible odds. Grant noticed it. The way Jonathan seemed to belong somewhere, far larger than this cracked sidewalk. "Sir," Grant said quietly to Malone, "maybe we should just let him be." But Malone, stubborn and spiteful, didn't hear or didn't care. He grabbed Jonathan by the arm roughly. That's when it happened. In a movement too fast for either officer to follow, Jonathan twisted his body slightly, shifting the balance, the way he might have neutralized an opponent in a hand-to-hand combat exercise years ago. He didn't strike, didn't hit, simply removed himself from Malone's grasp with the minimum force necessary. It was smooth, efficient, almost beautiful in its precision. It also lit a fuse in Malone's pride that no rational thought could extinguish. "You resisting me now?" Malone roared, yanking out his baton. Across the street, a few pedestrians began to slow, sensing trouble. Jonathan raised both hands slowly, palms out, a silent, universal symbol of nonviolence. "I don't want any trouble," he said calmly. Malone didn't care. He swung the baton, hitting Jonathan in the ribs. Jonathan grunted, stumbling back but refusing to go down. His duffel landed with a thud against the curb. The dog tag slipped from his fingers again, spinning once before settling, glinting sharply in the sun. Grant looked around, panic rising. People were filming now, phones out. The old rule of silence around the homeless didn't apply when the violence got this loud, this public. "Stop!" Grant hissed under his breath. But Malone was too far gone. "On your knees!" he shouted. Jonathan looked at him. Really looked at him. His eyes piercing and deep. Not angry. Not afraid. Just sad. Sad for Malone. Sad for a country that forgot its promises. Sad for a life that ended not on a battlefield but on a dirty sidewalk. Slowly, painfully, Jonathan knelt down. And as he did, a gust of wind picked up the fallen certificate near Grant's feet. It fluttered like a wounded bird. Grant bent down to catch it before it blew away. He froze as he read the faded words. Presidential Citation for Valor in Covert Operations, Commander Jonathan Watts. His throat went dry. He looked up at the man kneeling in the dirt, his clothes ragged but his bearing unbroken. "Sir?" Grant whispered hoarsely. Malone didn't hear him. But the rest of the city was about to, and so was the world. Grant backed away slowly, the certificate gripped tight in his hand like a lifeline to reality. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the pieces. The battered man on the ground, the commendation with presidential signature, the dog tags gleaming like tiny badges of truth. He felt sick. He felt trapped. Most of all, he felt the heavy weight of knowing they had just humiliated someone who had once risked his life for them all. Malone remained oblivious, too busy shouting commands to the gathering crowd. Step back, all of you," he barked, waving his baton in the air like a conductor gone mad. A woman across the street raised her phone higher. A man in a delivery uniform whispered to his coworker. A teenager in a hoodie mouthed something Grant couldn't hear, but he knew the word by heart. "Not a lawsuit." Jonathan stayed on his knees, breathing through the pain. His ribs ached from the baton strike, and his palms scraped against the broken sidewalk. But he stayed silent, calculating. "Wait." Grant crossed back toward Malone, his voice low and urgent. "Sir," he said, shoving the citation into Malone's chest, "you need to look at this." Malone barely glanced at it before brushing it aside. "I don't care what fake junk he's carrying. He's resisting. That's all that matters." "It's not fake," Grant's voice cracked. "Sir, this isn't just some random document. It's real, and that man, he's not what you think." Malone sneered. "What I think is you better start acting like a real cop, instead of some bleeding heart rookie, or maybe you." The first real crack in Malone's authority came not from the cameras, but from the murmurs. It started with the older woman in the red sweater standing by the bus stop, her voice shaky but clear as she pointed a trembling finger toward the dog tags lying near Jonathan's knee. "That man's military," she said. The comment rippled outward, picked up by a middle-aged man with a baseball cap. He leaned in closer, squinting at the tags, and then swore under his breath. "It's not just military," he said to no one in particular. "Those look like Black Ops tags. Special Forces, maybe." Jonathan kept his gaze down, his body steady, almost reverent, as if the act of kneeling wasn't defeat, but remembrance. Grant shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. His gut twisted with each second that passed. The memory of that battered commendation burned into his brain. The street, the cameras, the gathering crowd. It all seemed to press in on them, a slow, tightening vice. Malone's voice cut through it like a rusted blade. "You!" he barked at Grant. "Get him cuffed. Now!" Grant didn't move. Instead, he stood frozen, caught between two gravitational forces, one pulling him toward blind obedience, the other tugging at something he hadn't thought about since the academy. Integrity. "Emmons, sir, maybe we should wait for backup," Grant said, voice tight. "Maybe we should check his ID, see what's really going on." Malone's nostrils flared. His face was a brick wall of rage and pride. "You questioning me, rookie?" he growled. More phones were up now. A teenage girl with pink earbuds recorded the scene with wide, unblinking eyes. An old man in a wheelchair shook his head, muttering something that sounded like disgrace. Jonathan didn't move. Didn't resist. He just sat there, his body humming with pain and memories he didn't want to open yet. Then a voice broke through the noise. "What the hell is going on here?" Humiliate Reyes, her uniform crisp and her dark hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, strode into the scene like a storm front. Her eyes scanned everything in seconds. The homeless man kneeling with bloody knuckles, the furious veteran crowd assembling like a thundercloud, the two officers standing like boys caught with matches near a forest fire. Malone straightened, smoothing his uniform instinctively. "Captain," he said, forcing a grin. "Routine trespassing call." Grant said nothing, just clutched the citation in his hand like a guilty secret. Rhea's gaze flicked to the crumpled papers and tags on the ground. Her sharp eyes caught on the presidential seal stamped faintly across the torn commendation. "Routine, huh?" she said, voice dangerously low. Jonathan finally lifted his eyes to her, and for a fleeting second something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or something older. Respect, given and returned. "Get him up," Reyes ordered. "Gently." Grant moved first, offering Jonathan his hand without a word. Hesitation flickered across Jonathan's face before he accepted it, pulling himself to his feet with a pained grunt. He stood taller than both officers, battered but unmistakably proud. "Are you injured?" Reyes asked, voice softer now. "I live," Jonathan said, his tone dry. The crowd watched, silent and tense. Reyes turned back to Malone. "What's his name?" "We didn't get that far," Malone muttered. Grant finally spoke, clearing his throat. "Jonathan Watts, ma'am. Commander Jonathan Watts." Reyes froze. You could almost hear the collective intake of breath from the growing crowd. "Commander?" Reyes echoed, her voice sharp. Grant nodded, passing her the battered citation with shaking hands. She read it quickly, then again slower. When her eyes lifted back to Jonathan, they held something different now. A mix of awe, sorrow, and fury that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with what he represented. "Commander Watts," she said carefully, "do you have identification with you?" Jonathan reached into his jacket, slow and deliberate, and pulled out a weathered leather wallet. From inside he produced a military ID, faded but unmistakable. Reyes took it, her fingers trembling slightly. Malone's face twisted in confusion. "Mound," he blurted. "With respect, he's just another—" "Another what, Officer Malone?" Reyes snapped. "Another hero you treat like garbage?" The crowd rumbled, a low wave of agreement. Phones stayed up, catching every word. Reyes turned back to Jonathan, her expression tightening. "Would you be willing to come with me to the precinct, Commander? I'd like to straighten this out. Personally." Jonathan considered for a moment, then nodded once. "I'll go," he said, "but not in cuffs." Reyes bristled visibly at the insult implied by the suggestion. though she knew it wasn't aimed at her. "Of course not," she said, shooting a glare at Malone. "Grant, bring the commander's things," she added. Grant hurried to comply, carefully packing up the duffel, the dog tags, the journal. He paused, touching the commendation with reverence before sliding it carefully into the bag. As Jonathan moved to follow Reyes toward her unmarked cruiser, the crowd parted for him, slowly, respectfully. The woman in the red sweater reached out and touched his arm lightly as he passed, whispering something too soft for anyone else to hear. Jonathan gave her the barest nod. The walk to the car felt longer than it should have, not because of the pain, but because of what it meant. Every step peeled back layers of the man he had become, revealing slivers of the man he once was. At the cruiser, Reyes opened the door herself. Jonathan slid in without a word. Before following, Reyes turned back to the street and addressed the crowd, her voice ringing out, firm and clear. "We're going to take care of this." The people didn't cheer. They didn't boo. They just watched, measuring her words against the heavy ledger of what they had witnessed. Malone stood in the middle of it all, seething, his authority shredded and scattered like confetti. As the cruiser pulled away, Jonathan leaned his head back against the seat, his eyes closed. Grant watched them go, the duffel slung over one shoulder, the weight of everything heavier than he could bear. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because somewhere, behind the panic, behind the fear, behind the questions everyone was about to ask, a different kind of storm was building. One that didn't end when the cameras stopped rolling. One that wouldn't be satisfied until the whole truth came crashing out into the light. And for the first time in years, Jonathan Watts was ready to meet it head-on. Captain Reyes drove with both hands tight on the wheel, her jaw set like concrete. Jonathan sat in the passenger seat, silent, his gaze distant, watching the world blur past. He wasn't seeing the city anymore. He was somewhere else, somewhere dustier, hotter, where orders came over a crackling radio and every breath tasted like sand and gunpowder. He shook his head once, as if trying to knock the memory loose. Reyes noticed. "You still with me, Commander?" Jonathan nodded slightly, his voice a low rasp. "Yeah. Just think." "You're lucky," Reyes said, staring straight ahead. "Lucky someone caught that on camera, before things got worse." Jonathan gave a dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "Luck's got nothing to do with it." Reyes sighed and flicked on her turn signal. "You're not under arrest. You're not being detained. You're not a suspect. Just needed you somewhere safe until we sort this mess out." Jonathan nodded again, more to himself than her. Safe. That was a word that had stopped meaning anything a long time ago. The precinct loomed into view, a blocky, uninspired building framed by dying palm trees in a cracked parking lot. Reyes pulled into a reserved space, killed the engine, and turned to face him fully for the first time since they'd left the sidewalk. "I'm going to be straight with you, Commander. You're about to be in the middle of a storm. News outlets are already calling the front desk. The mayor's office rang 3 times before we even got halfway here." Jonathan met her gaze. His were older, sadder, but somehow stronger, too. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Reyes said. "Doesn't change that it's happening." She opened her door and stepped out into the brittle sunlight. Jonathan followed, feeling every bruise, every old injury as he moved. As he walked through the precinct doors, the usual low hum of conversation inside halted abruptly. Heads turned. Whispers snaked through the air like smoke. "That's him," someone muttered. "Decorated war hero," another voice said. Jonathan didn't react. He was used to being stared at for the wrong reasons. Dirt under fingernails, scraggly beard, threadbare clothes. Easy to dismiss, easy to condemn. But now they looked at him like a relic pulled from a battlefield museum. Reverence tangled with guilt in every glance. Race led him through the bullpen, past officers pretending not to look, and into her office. She closed the door behind them, shutting out the noise. The walls were lined with commendations and photos of her days in uniform. Marine Corps, judging by the sharpness in her bearing. "Sit," she said, motioning to the chair across from her desk. Jonathan lowered himself slowly, his ribs complaining with each breath. Rhea sat down heavily, opened a folder already waiting on her desk, and laced her fingers together. "You've been off the grid for a while," she said. Jonathan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The record spoke for itself. Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, 1 Medal of Honor nomination that had mysteriously vanished into classified files thicker than a city phone book. Then, nothing. A blank space where a life should have been. "You went dark after 2012, Reyes said. No known address, no known employment. Last credit card transaction was 5 years ago at a gas station in Nevada." Jonathan shrugged faintly. Hard to be part of a system that forgot you exist. Reyes leaned forward, elbows on her desk. "They didn't forget you, they buried you." Jonathan allowed himself a small, bitter smile. "Makes no difference. Buried's buried." Reyes tapped the folder with one finger, a slow, rhythmic beat. "Well, didn't you say anything?" she asked. "Back there, on the street, when he—" She cut herself off, jaw clenching. "When Malone started harassing you?" Jonathan thought for a long moment before answering. "Because shouting doesn't change anything. Because fighting back just makes it worse. Because—" He paused, searching for the words. "Because, after a while, you start to believe maybe you deserve it." The admission hung heavy in the room. Reyes shook her head. "You don't." Jonathan didn't argue. It didn't matter whether she believed it or not. Some truths lived in the marrow, unshakable and cruel. A sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Reyes stood and opened it a crack. Grant stood there, rigid and uncomfortable, Jonathan's duffel clutched in his hands like an offering. "We brought his things, Captain," he said. Reyes stepped aside to let him in. Grant entered, his cheeks flushed, eyes darting everywhere but at Jonathan. "Sir," Grant said, voice tight with shame. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have—" Jonathan raised a hand, stopping him. "You did better than most would," he said simply. Grant blinked, swallowed hard, and nodded. Reyes cleared her throat. "Grant's Tay, you're going to want to hear this." She turned to Jonathan, her expression deadly serious. "I made some calls," she said. "Called in a few favors. You weren't just any commander. You worked in a division so black even most generals don't know it exists. Top-tier clearance. Answered directly to the president." Jonathan's mouth twitched at the corner. "Used to." Reyes's voice dropped to nearly a whisper. "You're a ghost, Commander. Paperwork says you retired. But unofficially you were cut loose to protect state secrets. They made you disappear." Jonathan chuckled, but it was a hollow sound. "Looks like they did a good job." Reyes leaned over the desk, her eyes fierce. "Well, they're about to fail spectacularly." She turned her computer screen toward him. Dozens of emails, voicemails blinking on her office phone like angry red eyes. A live news feed already buzzing across social media. Footage of Malone shoving Jonathan, hitting him. Jonathan kneeling in the dirt. Dog tags glinting under a ruthless sun. America had seen it, and America was furious. Jonathan stared at the screen for a long moment. A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You don't want this to blow up?" he said quietly. Reyes tilted her head. "Maybe we do." He looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time since the entire ordeal began, he saw it. The same fire that had once burned in his own chest before the years and the betrayals had snuffed it out. "You know what happens next," Jonathan said. Reyes nodded grimly. "They'll scramble to fix this, offer you hush money, a medal ceremony, some cheap televised apology with smiling faces and empty words. And if I don't take it," her smile was thin and hard, "then they'll panic. And when powerful people panic, they make mistakes." Jonathan leaned back slowly, the chair creaking under him. The idea of stepping back into the world he had abandoned tasted sour in his mouth, but the idea of letting this moment slip away tasted worse. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the weight of all the men and women he had served with pressing against his shoulders, the ones who never made it home, the ones who did, only to be forgotten. When he opened them again, they were colder, clearer. "Then let's make them panic," he said. Grant let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Reyes grinned, sharp and fierce. "Welcome back, Commander." Jonathan didn't smile, didn't nod. He simply reached out, picked up his dog tags from the desk, and slipped them back around his neck where they belonged. The sound of the metal against his skin was soft. When it sounded like thunder, he had started with a single tweet. An anonymous bystander uploading the footage with a caption that burned hotter than gasoline. "Homeless man beaten by cops turns out to be war hero with presidential clearance." Within minutes it went viral, picked up by every platform, every screen, every news desk that needed a story hotter than the afternoon sun. By the time Jonathan sat quietly in Captain Reyes's office, finishing a lukewarm cup of precinct coffee, his face was plastered across TV screens coast to coast. News vans had already formed a ragged siege line outside the precinct, cameras craning their necks like vultures sensing blood. Protesters gathered too, some with homemade signs, others just holding their phones high, broadcasting their outrage live for anyone who would watch. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. Officers whispered in clusters. Senior brass shut themselves in rooms with frosted glass windows, silhouettes pacing frantically like caged animals. Even the rookies knew this wasn't just a bad look. It was a career ender. Captain Reyes leaned against the edge of her desk, arms folded, watching the chaos with grim satisfaction. "You're a walking bomb, Commander," she said, not unkindly. Jonathan sipped the coffee and set it down without comment. He had seen bombs before. This one was more precise, more surgical. It wasn't about destruction. It was about revelation. Reyes's phone rang again. She ignored it. The desk phone blinked red with a dozen waiting messages. Ignored those, too. "They're going to offer you a deal," she said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. "They'll send someone," she continued. "High level, slick suit, polished smile. They'll apologize, they'll flatter you, and then they'll offer you money. Or worse, a medal." Jonathan gave a slow nod. He knew the playbook, had watched it unfold too many times overseas, just wearing a different uniform. "Let me guess," he said. "They'll expect me to vanish again afterward." Reyes smiled grimly. "You learn fast." A knock rattled the door. Before Reyes could respond, it opened to reveal Chief Kenna, the highest-ranking officer in the department, a thick man with thinning hair and a face like boiled ham. He was sweating through his uniform, eyes darting around the room like a man cornered by his own mistakes. "Captain Reyes," he said, voice forced into false cheer, "and you must be Commander Watts." Jonathan didn't stand. He didn't need to. His presence filled the room without effort. Chief Kenna's grin faltered. "Think we've had a misunderstanding," Kenna said, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief. "And I want to personally assure you that the department is committed to making this right." Jonathan said nothing. Silence made people uncomfortable. It forced them to reveal more than words ever could. Kenna chuckled awkwardly. "In fact, if you're willing, we'd like to organize a special commendation ceremony for you. Full honors. Mayor's office involved, press coverage, everything." "And then what?" Jonathan asked, voice low. "You wash your hands of it, stick a medal on me, and send me back to the street?" Kenna flinched, the fake smile cracking for a moment. "Of course not," he said quickly. "We'll arrange housing, counseling, any services you need. But no real accountability," Jonathan said. It wasn't a question. Kenna's face reddened. "We have procedures to handle Officer Malone," he muttered. "Internal review board." Jonathan leaned forward just slightly. voice cutting like a scalpel. "You're hoping the noise dies down before the board ever meets." Reyes hid a smirk behind her hand. The chief shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "All we're asking is for you to cooperate. Meet us halfway. Think of the good it would do. A symbol of healing for the city." Jonathan stared at him. Slow, steady. "A symbol," he repeated. Kenna, thinking he'd found a crack, pressed on. "Exactly. Imagine it. Your story, a story of redemption, respect, patriotism." Jonathan rose from the chair without warning. The movement was smooth, almost silent. Kenna took an involuntary step back. "You want a symbol?" Jonathan said, his voice suddenly louder, vibrating through the walls. "Here's your symbol." He pulled the battered dog tags from around his neck and let them dangle between his fingers. "You want to pretend to honor me now because it's convenient, because you got caught. But where were you when it mattered? Where were you when a man like me could disappear into your streets without a second glance?" The whole precinct seemed to hold its breath. Kenna opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Jonathan dropped the tags back against his chest with a sharp metallic slap. "I don't need your ceremony. I don't need your photo ops." He took a step forward. Kenna shrank back. "What I need," Jonathan said, voice low and ferocious, "is for you to fix a system that treats its warriors like trash the minute they stop being useful." The chief sputtered, grasping for words. Jonathan brushed past him, the door swinging open wide, the bullpen falling silent as every head turned to watch him walk through. Captain Reyes fell in step beside him, her face tight with pride. "You're going to cause a riot," she muttered. Jonathan almost. "Good," he said. "Maybe they'll finally hear us." Outside, the crowd had doubled, spilling into the street, blocking traffic. Signs waved above heads. "Justice for Watts. Veterans deserve better. Honor our heroes." As Jonathan stepped into view, a spontaneous cheer erupted, raw and fierce. Phones rose like a forest of silver branches, capturing every second. For a moment, Jonathan hesitated. The easy thing would be to slip away, to let the momentum carry itself without him. But he thought of faces now. Faces he hadn't seen in years. Friends buried under foreign soil. Others lost to battles fought in their own minds long after the shooting stopped. He stepped forward, raising a hand, not to silence the crowd, but to steady himself against the tide of emotion. "I didn't come here for this," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, calm and unshakable. "I didn't ask to be here." He paused. The weight of the moment settled around him like armor. But maybe it's time we all stopped asking. The cheer that followed was deafening, rattling the glass in the precinct windows. Reyes moved closer, murmuring in his ear, "You sure you're ready for this?" Jonathan turned, his gaze clear and steady for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. "I was made for this," he said. Behind him, the city roared awake. And this time, it wasn't looking away. The city didn't sleep that night. Word spread faster than any official narrative could catch. News helicopters hovered over downtown, their spotlights sweeping the precinct like judgmental eyes from the heavens. Commentators debated furiously across split-screen panels, their voices urgent and desperate. Politicians scrambled to issue statements full of outrage, solidarity, and hollow promises. Everyone wanted a piece of Jonathan Watts, now. The forgotten hero who refused to stay forgotten. Jonathan watched it unfold from a window in a quiet upstairs room, far from the noise, far from the staged apologies gathering steam outside. Reyes had commandeered the small conference room for him, locking the door against curious officers and overeager journalists alike. Grant sat nearby, awkward in his own skin, fiddling with a half-empty coffee cup, not knowing if he was supposed to talk or stay silent. Jonathan preferred the silence. It was honest. A soft knock broke the stillness. Reyes opened the door a crack and slipped inside. She had a grim expression, and in her hand was a folder marked with the seal of the office of the president. They moved fast, she said, tossing it onto the table. Jonathan didn't reach for it, didn't even look at it. They want to meet, Reyes continued. Not just city officials anymore, federal. 2 agents downstairs. Suits. Black cars. Jonathan's lips twitched in something that almost resembled a smile. Let me guess, he said, voice dry. They want a quiet conversation, preferably somewhere out of the public eye. Reyes nodded grimly. They're scared. You're not just a news story anymore. You're a symbol. Jonathan turned back to the window, watching the crowd outside swell and shift like a living thing. Symbols are dangerous, he said. Grant finally found his voice, clearing his throat. But what are you going to do, sir? Jonathan didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed his forehead lightly against the cool glass, breathing slow and steady. Part of him, the part forged in war and betrayal, told him to walk away. Take whatever scraps they threw him, vanish again, survive in the shadows. But another part, buried deeper, older, and harder, refused. He turned back to them. I'm going to meet them, he said. Reyes frowned. Are you sure? They'll try to control the narrative, twist it. Jonathan's smile was thin. Let them try. Downstairs, the precinct lobby had been transformed into a stage. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, and police officers formed a loose, ineffective barrier trying to hold back the surge. 2 men in tailored black suits stood near the entrance, stone-faced and still. As Jonathan descended the stairs, the noise dimmed slightly, a ripple of awareness moving through the crowd. People craned their necks to see him, phones raised high, recording every step. The 2 agents moved forward. Commander Watts, the taller one said, offering a tight smile. Special Agent Harlan, this is Agent Monroe. We're here on behalf of the administration. We'd like to speak privately. Jonathan didn't extend his hand. He didn't smile. He simply looked past them to the rows of cameras, the waiting city. Anything you have to say, Jonathan said, loudly enough for the microphones to catch. You can say it here. Harlan's smile faltered. You really must insist. Jonathan stepped forward, closing the distance until he was almost nose to nose with the agent. I don't take orders from you, he said quietly. Not anymore. The words hit like a punch, raw and unapologetic. The crowd outside erupted in a cheer. Someone started chanting his name. Here. Harlan regrouped quickly, slipping into the well-practiced rhythm of political spin. Commander, we acknowledge that mistakes were made, grave mistakes. On behalf of the government, I want to offer you our deepest apologies. We propose a full, formal recognition ceremony, nationally televised. Additionally, a financial settlement for the injustice you've suffered. Jonathan said nothing, letting the offer dangle in the air, heavy and poisonous. And in return, he asked finally. Harlan's smile tightened. In return, we ask for your discretion, a public statement reaffirming your faith in the system, an assurance that justice has been served. Jonathan laughed then, a cold, humorless sound that cut through the noise like a blade. You want me to pretend everything's fine, he said. Smile for the cameras. Pat you on the back. Tell America it's safe to go back to sleep. Monroe stepped forward, trying a different tactic. Think of the good you could do, he said earnestly. Set an example. Heal divisions. Jonathan's face hardened. I'm not your bandage, he said. I'm not your distraction. Harlan's eyes narrowed. Careful, Commander, he said softly. You're not the only one with a past we can dig up. Jonathan took another step forward, until the agents were forced to backpedal slightly. You think you can scare me, he said. I've seen death. I've buried friends whose names you'll never know. I've bled for a country that forgot me the minute the cameras stopped rolling. He raised his voice, letting it carry over the stunned crowd. Ailment, I don't owe you a damn thing. The silence that followed was electric. Grant stood frozen by the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. Reyes watched with a grim smile, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Arland made a last desperate play, pulling a slim envelope from his jacket. "Oh, $1 million, he said, voice low. "Tax-free, right now. Walk away." Jonathan stared at the envelope like it was something rotting. Nini took it, held it up high where every camera could see, and tore it cleanly in half. "Does he miss it?" The sound was shockingly loud. Gasps echoed through the room. The crowd outside roared. Jonathan let the pieces flutter to the ground. "You can't buy what you already stole," he said. He turned his back on the agents, walking toward the door. For a moment they stood frozen, unsure what to do, stripped of their power by nothing more than truth laid bare. As Jonathan stepped outside, the crowd erupted. Hundreds of people surged forward, not to trap him, but to lift him, to hold him up with their voices, their signs, their outstretched hands. The night air was thick with chants now. "Justice for Watts. Honor our veterans." "Thea, Jonathan." For the first time in years, Jonathan didn't feel invisible. He felt seen. He felt heard. He smiled. And for the first time since he could remember, he allowed himself a small, real smile. Captain Reyes slipped outside beside him, shaking her head. "You realize," she said, "this isn't the end. They're not going to give up." Jonathan glanced sideways at her, the corner of his mouth still curled upward. "And I am," he said. He looked out at the sea of faces, the hundreds of strangers who refused to let him be erased again. "But this time," he said quietly, "neither am I." The cameras caught it all. The broken man standing tall once more. The veteran who had become something more dangerous than any soldier on any battlefield. He had become the truth they couldn't silence. And the world, finally, was listening. Morning broke with a sharp blue sky, so clear it seemed almost surreal. The city still buzzed with electricity from the night before, but there was a different energy now. A kind of hope that spread through the streets, like the smell of rain after a drought. Overnight, something had shifted. Jonathan Watts was no longer just a trending headline. He had become a rallying cry. Inside the precinct conference room, Captain Reyes sipped from a chipped coffee mug as she watched Jonathan lace up a pair of donated boots. Real boots. Solid. The kind a man could walk in without shame. "You ready?" she asked. Jonathan finished tightening the laces, then looked up at her. His face was weathered, lined by years most people couldn't imagine living through, but there was something new in his eyes now, something steady and alive. "I was born ready," he said simply. Downstairs, a black SUV idled at the curb, waiting to take him to City Hall. Reyes would accompany him. Grant, too, in uniform now, standing a little taller than he had the day before. A small security detail hovered near the doors, though it felt unnecessary. The people outside were not a threat, they were his shield. As Jonathan stepped through the precinct's front doors, the crowd parted in reverent silence. Reporters tried to shout questions, but the noise fell away when he passed. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled, and yet the only sound that truly mattered came from the people themselves. A steady chant that pulsed like a heartbeat. "Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you." It wasn't loud, it wasn't frenzied. It was pure. The SUV ride to City Hall was short but strange. Grant fidgeted nervously, his hat clutched between his hands. Reyes kept glancing toward Jonathan as if half expecting him to vanish again, like a dream slipping through her fingers. "You know, Si," she said finally, "you don't have to say anything you don't want to say. No script. No pressure." Jonathan smiled faintly. "I've had something to say," he said. "Been carrying it too long." City Hall was surrounded by a ring of security, but it wasn't to keep people out. It was to organize the sheer volume of the crowd that had shown up in support. Veterans in faded uniforms, young families waving flags, students with homemade banners reading "Real Heroes Walk Among Us." Jonathan stepped out into a roar of applause. The mayor, a slim man with anxious eyes and a perfect smile, waited on the steps. Flanked by aides and political figures, he extended his hand as Jonathan approached. "Commander Watts," the mayor said loudly for the microphones, "on behalf of this city and truly this nation, we owe you a debt of gratitude." Jonathan shook his head firmly, giving the cameras the photo they wanted, but his eyes said otherwise. The mayor shifted uncomfortably under the weight of that gaze. A podium stood at the top of the steps, framed by American flags snapping crisply in the breeze. A microphone waited. Jonathan stepped up to it. The crowd fell silent. For a long moment, he simply stood there, looking out across the sea of faces, men and women, old and young, rich and poor, all of them gathered for something bigger than politics or headlines. They had gathered for dignity. "I didn't want this," Jonathan said, his voice calm, carrying easily without shouting. "I didn't ask for cameras. I didn't ask for ceremonies." He paused, scanning the crowd. "But maybe this isn't about me. Maybe it's about all the others. The ones you don't see. The ones sleeping under bridges tonight. The ones fighting battles you can't see. The ones who gave everything only to be forgotten when their usefulness ended." A murmur ran through the crowd. Heads nodded. Hands clutched hearts. "I stand here," Jonathan continued, "because I refuse to stay invisible." He touched the dog tags around his neck, letting them glint briefly in the sun. "But I also stand here for every veteran who can't, for every soul that this country asked everything from and then abandoned." The crowd surged with emotion. Some wiped away tears. Others simply stood, rooted to the spot, listening like it was gospel. "I don't want your medals," Jonathan said. "I don't want your parades." He looked straight into the cameras now, his voice cutting sharper. "I want your respect. I want your action. I want your promise that no man or woman who serves this nation will ever be treated as expendable again." The mayor shifted nervously behind him. But it didn't matter. Jonathan wasn't speaking for him. He was speaking for the invisible army that had carried this country on its broken backs for too long. He ended simply, without flourish. "Don't thank me with words," he said. "Thank me by doing better." The silence afterward was so complete it felt holy. Then, like a spark touching dry grass, the applause erupted. Not polite clapping, not staged enthusiasm. It was real. It was deafening. It was earned. Jonathan stepped back from the microphone and let the wave of sound wash over him. He didn't need to say anything more. He had given them the truth, and now it was theirs to carry. The mayor tried to say something into the microphone, but it was useless. His words were swallowed whole by the roar of the people. Jonathan felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to find Captain Reyes standing there, her eyes suspiciously bright. "You did good, Commander," she said. Grant appeared beside her, looking awkward, but proud. "You showed 'em who you are," Grant said. Jonathan shook his head gently. "No," he said. "I showed them who they could be." The three of them stood together on the steps, not as symbols, not as politicians, but as people. Later, as the sun dipped low and the crowds finally began to thin, Jonathan found himself sitting on a bench near the reflecting pool. Children played nearby. A group of veterans swapped stories and jokes by a food truck. The city, his city now, moved around him, not in ignorance, but in awareness. A familiar bark caught his attention. Jonathan turned to see a golden retriever bounding toward him, dragging a grinning volunteer from the VA center behind it. The dog wore a vest emblazoned with the words, "Service Dog in Training." "Commander Watts?" the volunteer called breathlessly. "This little guy's for you, if you want him. It's part of the new outreach program they're starting. Because of you." Jonathan knelt as the dog barreled into him, tongue lolling, tail wagging hard enough to knock dust off the sidewalk. He ruffled the dog's fur, feeling something inside him ease. "What's his name?" Jonathan asked. "Feller," the volunteer said, smiling wide. Jonathan laughed softly. The sound was pure, whole. "Fitting," he said. He clipped the leash to his wrist and stood, valor pressing close against his leg. As he turned to leave, the sunset casting gold across the city he had once thought forgotten him, Jonathan Watts felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Not anger, not pain, not regret, but real hope for himself, for the others, for all of them. And he walked forward into the gathering night, the street lights flickering on one by one, not as a ghost, not as a forgotten man, but as a living testament that no sacrifice, no life, and no story would ever again be left unseen.